of the higher educated upper and middle classes. This is what you expect people at Yale and Stanford to be using when they give presentations, where even pretty well educated people are getting about half of it, but that's okay because it's educated. When we tell our students to follow strictly grammatical rules in writing that bar even like mildly informal speech, think things like extremely common contractions. You can't use don't in an essay. You have to say do not, right? We're not teaching them proper English because proper English doesn't exist. We're teaching them to conform to a specific dialect. And I think that that's a really important distinction, to not use this term of proper English, because the British would disagree that what we're teaching is proper English because their English is proper English. And the Australians would disagree with both of us. So what we're really teaching is teaching them to conform to a specific dialect, one that may or may not have practical applications for them beyond the classroom. And as a community college, I think it's also important to be aware that many of the students here are first-generation college students raised in a household that doesn't use the academic dialect in everyday speech. I know I'm privileged in that my mother has a PhD and my father has like 280 college credits but didn't get a degree. That's a whole separate story. But a lot of people don't use standard American English in their everyday speech at home with their kids. And a lot of people certainly don't use academic English at home with their kids. So for a student with little or no exposure to these dialects, we really have to be aware that we're not asking them to perform proper English. Again, that doesn't really exist. What we're really asking is for them to pick up a new dialect. We just don't frame it that way. So as an English teacher, I start my semester by explaining to students that, yeah, college composition is hard. And I tell them explicitly that college composition is hard because they're not just learning punctuation and grammar and vocabulary. They're learning a whole new dialect. And the skills that come with proficiency in a new dialect require as much practice as learning a new language. If we take a minute to consider some, and these are fairly well-known examples, so you may have heard these before, but for those of you who haven't especially, consider the difference between dialect and language. Norwegian and Swedish. Are these two languages or are they two dialects? And you can put your answers in text or say them out loud. Norwegian and Swedish. Two languages or two dialects? How would you define those? And if you have a reason, I'm happy to hear your reason. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of answers that they're two separate languages. And politically, they are defined as two separate languages. But in linguistics, we actually consider them to be dialects. They're defined as languages by the countries that speak them, by the people who speak them. But if a Norwegian person and a Swedish person are standing at a bus station, they can communicate with each other very easily. It would be no different than somebody from New York trying to communicate with somebody from Atlanta, Georgia, right? Their languages are so similar that they're really only separate because, and there's a famous quote, that a difference between a dialect and a language is an army and a navy, right? The idea that a language is something that is defined politically. If you have the power to say we speak a different language, then okay, yeah, you speak a different language, right? So that's what happened with Norway and Sweden. What about Mandarin and Cantonese? Would you say that those are dialects or would you say that those are languages? Okay, we've got some dissent already. So, yeah, a lot of people would say that Mandarin and Cantonese are dialects of Chinese, right? But yeah, Michael Booker, you've actually got the answer exactly, that they are not mutually intelligible, right? You can't put a Cantonese speaker and a Mandarin speaker at a bus station and have them able to communicate with each other unless one of them happens to be bilingual. So they're actually separate languages linguistically. But we all think of it as being two dialects of the same language, largely because they're spoken within the same country, right? There is no Army and Navy to say Cantonese is a separate language from Mandarin. Dialect is a spectrum. And really, it's a spectrum. It's maybe even more like a color wheel. Some colors are clearly not the same, right? Blue and red are not the same. We can say definitively that like German and Chinese are two different languages. But you can combine colors to get various shades of other colors, right? So blue and red, not the same, but you can combine them to get various shades of purple. Languages can also be combined in this way. That's actually how English developed. English is German with some French, mostly. That's oversimplifying a lot of things, but largely English is German with some French. And there are also other related languages to German and French coming together. Dialects are more like hues. So violet is purple, lavender is purple. And if you show either one of them to a 4-year-old, they're both purple, right? Boston English is English, Appalachian English is English, and African American English is also English. So what defines proper English, and why do we feel like there's a proper English? And we are going to go into breakout rooms here in a minute, but first I want to clearly state that the rules of English are largely made up. And a lot of people get very upset to hear that because we want there to be firm rules. We want to understand why we talk the way we talk, why we write the way we write, and why we're told to do things in a certain way. But the reality of the situation is some British grammarians hundreds of years ago said that English should try to be more like Latin. And again, English is the child of German and French. English is not a Latin language. So when you have somebody say, English should try to be more like Latin, that sounds great. But realistically, we're not really very closely related to Latin, so it's really hard to put into practice. So that's where we get rules like we shouldn't split infinitives, and prepositions should never go at the end of a sentence, right? That all comes from the idea that we should try to be more like Latin. And the origins of English, like I said, not derived from Latin. We're a direct descendant of German, and we really only have anything resembling Latin in our language because in 1066, the French invaded England in the Norman invasion, which is, by the way, why cow meat is called beef, but chicken meat is just called chicken. Like there's explanations for that, and it comes back to the Norman invasion. So when your history teacher said that the Norman invasion was the most important thing to happen to the English-speaking world, it's also the most important thing to happen to English because it changed English fundamentally. So with some of that out of the way, I would like to spend about 10 minutes, if we could go into breakout groups, and I want you guys to talk about what defines proper English. What exactly is it that you want students and peers and colleagues to be doing or not doing, alternatively, when they speak or when they write? what absolutely should not be changed by incoming generations. And we'll go to breakout groups. All right. So we'll give it a couple minutes as people come back. But does anybody have any perspectives that they wanted to share in talking about this topic? I know we went a very interesting direction in ours. So I'm curious to hear what directions people went in.
Sure, certainly. Oh, here comes people.
Oh, sorry, what was that, Chris?
I said certainly, and here come more people.
Yes.
I don't know, do you mean it now or when people come back?
We can go either way. If somebody has something they're excited to share, I'm happy for us to start talking before everyone's fully returned.
We agreed pretty quickly just on that proper English is largely contextual, and that there's agreement that no really proper English, but certainly structure that's required for different environments like academics or profession, business type environments, but more focus on like writing. I think structural importance, the importance of structure in writing more than dialect. And just the observation that I definitely don't speak the same way that I write, and it's immediately apparent once I'm in an informal environment and I'm still speaking academically, that just doesn't fit in that environment. So just kind of an interesting conversation.
Yeah, and what you're talking about there with the last part of that is code switching, moving in between dialects or languages or even registers, which would be, talking about an IT worker working on the family computer and staying in IT explanation mode instead of explaining to family member. Or you have your teacher voice on.
I get that too, Sarah. And yeah, we talked a lot about code switching too, and not so much. Sometimes the words that we use, but also honestly, my accent changes even too sometimes to kind of assimilate with the people I'm around.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, did you have something you wanted to?
Oh, I've got a dumb illustration for you of code switching. So back in the 90s, I was in the Tennessee Army National Guard while I was in graduate school. And when I was in uniform, I was used to speaking with people with a heavy East Tennessee accent. And so I didn't try to mirror that, but I modified the way I spoke. And then I had to do a couple of months of stuff up in Minnesota. And so I was helping out with the unit there. And I started realizing that when I put the uniform on, I started speaking with a Southern accent, which in Minnesota made no sense whatsoever. And I wasn't even catching myself at first. I don't think anybody really noticed it as heavily as I did. It's like, why in the world did that? Again, I'm making this association now, and I'm changing my speech patterns because that's what I'm used to doing in this particular context. But a Southern accent in Minnesota, because I was in uniform, was just yeah.
Yeah. And Dina, did you have something you wanted to throw in?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that with the different accents. My husband is from Rhode Island, so he has the East Coast accent, but only when he's with people with that same accent. So he has lived here since college, so 30 plus years. And when his parents were both still alive and they would come visit, he would pick up some of that accent. And to me, it was hard because my name is Dina, but they would always say Diener. And his name is Pete. They'd call him Peter, but it would be Pete up. And I'm like, I don't understand. Your name ends in ER, but it has my A sound. That should be at the end of mine, And so that was really hard. And he still does it. If we travel back towards the East Coast, as soon as he gets there, he starts in with that accent. It is like the switch goes on immediately. But here in St. Louis, you would never hear that out of him.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Joe, you also had something you wanted to share.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit in my group, but I'm taking this class at Mizzou with a guy named Mike Metz who does sociolinguistics, and he actually interviews English teachers in, I think it's like in high school, and he's asking the same question where he's talking about things like code switching in African American youth, and he's like asking the teachers, "Do you think there's such a thing as standard American English?" And some of them will say no, some of them will say yes, and then he shows them these videos of how much more comfortable and how much more productive classroom discussions are when like they don't give a speech at the beginning of their first class saying like, we will use proper grammar when we're speaking in this classroom. How much more at ease people are when they're allowed to use their sort of informal or vernacular dialects, I guess.
Oh, that's really interesting. I would love to get their contact information, knowing that they're operating in the St. Louis area.
They're in Columbia. I just put their Google Scholar
Oh,
thing in the chat.
okay. Thank you. Yeah, I definitely appreciate the link. But yeah, there has been some research into the productivity level of students who are allowed to use their home dialect. And you have to consider, when you start a class with "we will use proper English," people who are already insecure about their language skills become more insecure about their language skills. And language is what we use to communicate. That's the purpose of it. So if you are getting frustrated because your students are not responding to your questions in class, but you started the semester with "we will use proper English when we talk," they're probably scared of being judged based on the way that they say their answers, more so than they might even be about the content of the answer. And I do think that that is a major risk in English classes in particular. Not that you don't hear it in other courses as well, but I know that I would love to hear more of my students talk. And I hear that complaint all the time. My students are so quiet. And if we're shutting them down before they've even had a chance to speak, that's an interesting and problematic situation. So a question from Michael Booker: if you say "ax" instead of "ask," does it put you at a disadvantage in the larger culture? So that is a question that is being asked more and more. When we go back to conversations about mutual intelligibility, right? Talking about, can we understand each other at a gas station, at a bus stop, in a grocery store? Ultimately, if I say, "let me ask you a question," you know what I'm saying. So there is also this concern about how arbitrary is that, right? If I understand what you're saying and I'm correcting you or pretending like I don't understand because I don't like the way that you've said it, is that appropriate? And I would also look at how many things we have incorporated into our culture happily that once were judged because they were part of a different culture, right? So how many of you use "yas" when you respond to a text or an email or other kinds of message that you are excited about, right? You get like the "yas queen" over being excited about something, or you're asked to do something and you send a message to a friend of yours that explains the situation and you say, "ain't nobody got time for that," right? It's sort of a funny thing that we incorporated into the larger culture that ultimately African American students were being judged for using those same words because they were incorrect. But then we've adopted them and said, "oh yes, these are fun and we like using them." Is that fair, right? So yeah, that's a really interesting question to reflect on, Michael, about "ax" versus "ask." And I think that asking ourselves, how important is that distinction? Yeah, Dina.
I have a question for you. How does like Webster's dictionary adding additional words and things like that, does that play play into this at all? Every year they have different words that are now, whether that's written or spoken words that are used, it kind of follows what you're saying. But how do you feel that connects with these kind of conversations over time of what is acceptable or not acceptable?
Sure. Yeah, so that's a really good question as well. For a long time, people would say ain't a word because it ain't in the dictionary. And then it was added to the dictionary. If you tell people that proper English is using words that are in the dictionary, then ain't should be allowed in student papers, because it is in the dictionary. And we are constantly adding additional words to the dictionary, in large part because dictionaries are a descriptive tool. English grammar classes are prescriptive, right? So we're telling people how we should use language rather than explaining how we do use language. And dictionaries, I think, are an unfortunate, not victimist, it's that they get caught in the middle, right? Prescriptivists say we should look to the dictionary as the epitome of correctness, but in reality, the people that write dictionaries are trying to tell us what words mean that are being used. And that means that there are words being added that people may disagree with. And there has been some complaint from English teachers that dictionaries are adding more and more slang terms. But I would also raise the question, somewhat related to that. If dictionaries only kept up with non-slang terminology, our dictionaries would be as difficult to read as, I would say, Shakespeare, but actually Shakespeare is quite a lot of slang. Our dictionaries would be set in the 1600s, 1500s, right? Of us saying, well, this is what is correct English. And if we never update it, then we run into the same problems that French has, actually. So how many of you have taken French, like in high school or college? Okay. At least one. Right, of course, Michael. The French that is taught in schools in the United States is the same French that the Academy of the French Language in France says is correct French. How many of you have taken French and then gone to a country that speaks French and actually tried to interact with people around you? Okay. French that is spoken on the streets of France is wildly different from the French that you're taught in the classroom, right? And yeah, there are differences too, Chris, with Spanish, right? I majored in Spanish. Oh yeah, Arabic is a whole other thing. But like, I majored in Spanish in college. My teachers, one of my major professors was from Argentina, and the other one was from Spain. I had two very different versions of Spanish being taught to me simultaneously. And then I spent 6 months in Mexico. My Spanish was very confused. Not that I couldn't express myself, but that my vocabulary was all over the place. My grammar was all over the place because am I using vos? Am I using vosotros? No, I'm in Mexico. They don't use either of those. Okay, I'll just throw that entire grammatical knowledge out the window and pretend it doesn't exist, but only here. Diane, do you have a question or a comment, or was that a yes, I've been to French speaking place? Okay. I'm assuming that was I've just been to a French place. Yeah. So these are absolutely concerns that we have to be thinking about when it comes to Oh, okay, great. When it comes to talking about dialect too, right? Dialect is the same way. And, as Dina raised the question of, well, what about our dictionaries, right? And to use dictionaries as a descriptive tool and a prescriptive tool at the same time makes it a much more complex issue. Richard.
Yes. Okay. As I'm an English teacher, let's just say, and I could go anywhere. It could be DeSoto, Missouri. It could be Mississippi. It could be North St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
How do I? So I'm trying to prepare these students out if they're going to go to college or for post secondary life. Uh, do I try to raise them? Do I condescend to them or try to talk like them? Or should I try to elevate them or elevate to proper English, so to speak? That's my question.
Yeah, and that ultimately is sort of the question, isn't it? What do we do with this information now that we are looking at it and saying, okay, I understand that proper English doesn't exactly exist, but at the same time, the idea of it is still present, and there is a utility to it, right? This idea that if you can't speak English to a certain standard, that you're going to have trouble getting ahead. And in a lot of ways, to me, the answer to that is be honest and upfront with students. Tell them that their version of English is valid, that it's a legitimate form of English, and that they're encouraged to use it. But also that in the English classroom, their job is to learn a new version of English that they can use when they need it. Right? So ultimately, I think that what we should be doing is teaching code switching, teaching students that there's nothing wrong with the language that they have. We're just giving them another tool in their kit, right? You have African American English, and that has really important purpose in African American communities. You can build identity, group identity is so important, and dialect is a major player in group identity. But then somebody goes to work in an office and their boss expects them to use a standard variety of English, and they're told that their dialect is inappropriate. Is it kind? No. And when we talk about mutual intelligibility, I would ask, what is the real purpose behind telling someone not to use African American English? If you're talking to somebody on the phone, as a secretary or something, and they can understand you and you can understand them, then why can't they use their version of English? And I think that that's a really important question to consider. And I think we'll all come to our own versions of answers to that question. But I think we have to do some soul searching about why it's important. And if it's important because we've arbitrarily said the people in charge think it's important, then we should be asking people who are in charge, why is it important? If I'm understood and I can understand, then why? Right? And Maddie says, many English teachers who have talked like students and had our general terms down, but they still asked for us to learn and perform proper English when they asked or needed it. Yeah, Maddie, do you want to expand on your comment? The floor is yours. Yeah, so if anybody is not able to see Maddie's comments in the text, so what she's saying is that she tends to find that the best environment is one where teachers try to understand and connect with the students, and that it's not that their dialect is wrong, but that they should have to learn the academic standard for success in the future. And I think that that's exactly where we should be angling for as a starting point to deal with this problem, is to at least start with the understanding going into the classroom that somebody from the mountains of Tennessee who speaks Appalachian English isn't a hick because of how they speak. And that somebody who speaks African American English isn't a thug because of how they speak, right? The way that you speak is not a marker of intelligence, right? And I was victim, or not victim, I guess, but a perpetrator of that belief. When I was in high school, I told somebody that had an Appalachian accent that I would never consider being in a relationship with somebody who spoke like them. And now I understand that that is a terrible thing to tell somebody. But at the time, I was thinking I would never want to date somebody who is anti-intellectual. And I didn't understand that I was associating his accent with being unintelligent. Looking back on that, I feel terrible, and I've apologized to the person. But we have these built-in biases that we assume somebody's intelligence level based on how they speak. We assume somebody's economic level based on how they speak. There was a study done by a gentleman named John Baugh, who actually was a Washington University professor for a while, where he was trilingual, tridialectal. He could speak the standard American English. He's a professor. He also spoke academic English as part of that. He also spoke Chicano English and African American English. And he did an experiment where he would call the same leasing agencies asking about apartment availability. And he would call them once in the standard English accent, once in Chicano English accent, and once in African American English accent. And he found statistically that if he called and used an African American accent or a Chicano English, so Spanish speaking English accent, he would be told by the leasing agencies that apartments were not available more often, by a lot, than if he called using the standard. So apartments that weren't available when he was using the African American dialect suddenly were available when he was using the standard dialect. He was able to book an appointment to go see an apartment that he had been told 15 minutes ago didn't exist, that it had already been rented out. And so this does create problems that are built into the way that we see language. And there was at some point a purpose to these tools, right? Building group identity based on dialect. But as we become more and more integrated with each other, it's really important that we don't discriminate against each other based solely on the way that we speak. And Michael, you're absolutely right. This is not unique to English. It is certainly a problem in English as well, but it is a problem of humanity, right? Anywhere you have dialects, you have discrimination based on dialect. And even places you don't have dialect. Go ahead, Michael.
So as educators, we can't change the world by willing it to be otherwise. And if we say it doesn't matter when you speak a non-standard variety of the language, again, my point would not be that that's right, but that that's true. It is true that you will experience, if you say ax instead of ask, people will assume that you lack intelligence. I ran into this when I was living in the South, that I became sensitive to the fact that in popular media, that Southern accent, of course, means that you're dumb. And it certainly wasn't true of the people I knew, but that's just the reality of it. And it's good to have in your back pocket the ability to speak in something that is not as identifiable regionally for an accent, and then to switch again, do this code switching, which then allows you to go back at home and sound normal back with your family. And then when you are in the public arena, not speak in a way which, again, I'm not saying fair or unfair. I don't think it's fair, but you will be judged. And I can tell you examples from countries I've been to where they do the same darn thing. It's very routine to have regional dialects that mean stupid.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that your point about the classroom is absolutely fair. We can't will things to be different. I would challenge a little bit that in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, people with college degrees are more likely to be in charge of others, right? That's one of the things that we pitch as colleges, is that if you want to get ahead, then a college degree is going to help you do that. And I think by teaching any degree of awareness of this to people who might be managers, to people who might be CEOs, to people who might open a small business and hire 4 people, teaching them at some point the idea that your employees are not lesser people because they have a different accent. It's a place to start. It's not fair that people get judged on how they speak, but how do you unteach unfairness? And the only way to do that is to try, is to tell people this isn't fair, but it is what it is. And what small step can you take? Can you hire a secretary that doesn't transition easily into standard American English and let them use African American English and see that they do fine as a secretary? See that they do the job, and then you've done something on your end to mitigate that problem, right? And it does open up avenues too. You get somebody who has a Chicano English accent working as, again, I'm using the example of a secretary, working as a secretary, and somebody calls into, let's say it's a secretary for school, calls into a school and hears that familiar accent and is more comfortable talking to that person because they can hear that they come from a similar background. Is there value to that that would be worth trying to keep, trying to move towards the idea of embracing all dialects as long as there's some mutual intelligibility, right? And I think ultimately that is a major component of it, right? If somebody has no mutual intelligibility, that becomes an issue that is separate, right? Okay, yeah. And I see several people are leaving. If we have any other comments, I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to take additional commentary.
Diane, your hand is up. Did you want to speak?
I think her hand was from the French
Okay.
conversation,
Okay.
and just hasn't come back down.
Well, McKenzie, thank you for this presentation today. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody did. Thank you so much. And you all have a very nice weekend, and I'll see you soon. Thank you. Okay. Stay on the line, McKenzie.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your attention and your insights.